There's been a lot of debate recently about whether or not our economy is in a recession. A lot of you guys even say we're already in a depression. And some people say, what are you talking about? This is still the best economy ever. So there's a lot of people who are all over the place, and because there's no consensus on this, there's actually not really a real definition of what is a recession. And that's part of the problem. Jack Schnepp was an economist that created a recession indicator, which is called the Schnepp Recession Indicator. And what it does is it tracks U.S. unemployment data to figure out whether or not we're in a recession. Pretty simple. And according to the Schnepp Recession Indicator, all 12 recessions that the United States has had since 1946 have been detectable by this indicator. They say that it was actually only wrong one time, which was in October of 1959, 6 months prior to the recession, which commenced in April 1960. It's funny because as I'm making this video, I literally got this comment pop up on my phone that says we are not in a recession. We are not in a recession. That was years ago. We are entering into a depression like we have never experienced in our lifetimes, which very well could end up being true. But the problem is, like I said, there is no definition or consensus of what a recession is. People can't agree on it, and therefore that's why we have all these different opinions. So when we use indicators like this, it kind of takes away all that guesswork, and then we can use this to gauge whether or not we are in fact in a recession. And what this recession indicator does is it's based on the 3-month moving average of the unemployment rate. And a recession is triggered when it rises by at least 0.4 percentage points from that moving average's prior cyclical low. And the SRI's latest recession signal indicator was triggered on June 7th of 2024 with the report of May's unemployment rate 4.0%. And this brought the 3-month moving average to 3.9%. That's a 0.4% higher increase than where the moving average stood in April of last year, which indicates that we are moving into a recession. But the biggest problem here is that recessions are just hard to predict. The National Bureau of Economic Research will declare that a recession has begun officially. And so here's why you can't rely on them to tell us whether or not we're in a recession. And it's because they take months and sometimes even over a year to determine that a recession has begun. That's actually exactly what happened back in 2008. We were already in a recession by the end of 2007, but they never called it a recession until the end of 2008. So it basically took a year for the official consensus to come out and say, yeah, this is actually a recession. In fact, sometimes they can take so long to call the recession that the recession can actually be over by the time they actually say that we're in one. So that's why, once again, it's up to you to do your own research, to be in the loop on your own and watch channels like mine to kind of get ahead on this stuff. And if there are recession indicators out there that are flashing red right now that say that we are in a recession or on the precipice of one, I think it's important to pay attention to that. And you have that first mover advantage. Say if you want to sell your house now, probably a better time than in 6 months or a year from now, for example. That could be, one relatable way to use this information to your advantage. And check this out. The average lag time for the SRI that we're talking about here, the Schnepp Recession Indicator, is only about 1.5 months, guys. If the signal started flashing red on June 7th, that puts us roughly at the end of July, probably, where we're really going to see the recession become official. But the National Bureau of Economic Research won't call it official until months or maybe even a year later. So it's really to your advantage to know this stuff. And to give you an example, the SRI was triggered in early February 2008 upon the release of the January 2008 unemployment data, which was 2 months into the recession and nearly a year prior to when they announced it in December of 2008. So that's how accurate this is and how forward-looking this can be. And I, for one, would rather know about it today than wait for the government to come out and tell us that it's actually happening. Because The way things are going right now, you can't rely on them to tell us anything accurately anymore. And they're saying this is even more accurate than the inverted yield curve that we've had since July of 2022, which has always historically been an indicator of a recession. But some people are saying that it's not this time because so far we haven't hit one. But that also depends on who you ask, right? Because since there's not really a real definition of what's a recession and what isn't, it kind of puts people in the position of, kind of forming their own definition of what a recession is to them. But I think most people are looking at inflation and their increased cost of living as a personal definition of recession for them, because it's gotten so unaffordable so fast. It's not making people feel good about this economy. In fact, I think a lot of people out there would even say that they would rather have a recession than have the amount of inflation that we have right now. Because in case you don't remember, when we had the big great financial crisis in 2008, we didn't actually have inflation. In fact, there was a little bit of deflation. If we look at this Fred chart, it shows you that inflation actually came down when the economy was sinking and it went into deflation, which is actually a good thing. It means prices are getting cheaper and things are becoming more affordable at a time when people desperately need it the most. But now we're almost in an opposite situation where inflation is still really high, but we're already heading into a recession. Talking about kicking you while you're down, you're getting hit with the higher cost of things at the same time the economy is getting rough. But the general consensus of what a recession is are a couple different things. You have 2 negative quarters of GDP. Other people will say that it's rising unemployment combined with falling stock prices. That characterizes a recession. But once again, there's not any real official definition. But I guess there really doesn't have to be, because if you have some of those things happening and they don't call it an official recession, a lot of people like us can be smart enough to realize that it still is one, even if the government doesn't want to admit it. But here's some data on what can happen to people during a recession. And some people say, well, if it's better if we're in a recession than to have all this inflation. I guess it depends also who you ask, because there's data on this that says that if you lose your job during a recession, that it can severely impact your future earning losses when it comes to, your household income, and it can actually drop your lifetime earnings of close to $112,000 over the next 25 years. Now, I don't know if this is true. This is just a stat I read from a business story. But it is harder to find a job in a recession because you have less people hiring. But look, guys, we just talked about this the other day. There's all these supposed job openings right now, and you have well-qualified people applying for them, yet they're not getting hired. So what is the difference between having a recession and no jobs available, or having a bunch of jobs available that no one's getting hired for? To me, it's the same thing, because the end result is the same. People who are looking for a good job are not able to get one. So I would even argue to say that what we're experiencing right now is worse than a recession, because we have job openings, people can't get them. We have high inflation, and people are losing jobs. The layoffs have been massive so far this year. The only indicator here that hasn't really happened yet, that people look for to see that we're in a recession, is the stock market crashing. And here's another reason why it's hard to tell if we're in a recession or not, because even during a recession, a lot of people still do really well. During the 2008 recession, which is obviously the worst one we've had since the Great Depression, there's no disputing that. Even during that bad time, unemployment rate only went up to 10%. Okay, so you're talking 10% of people unemployed, and 90% of people are fine and are still working. And back then we didn't have high inflation, so as long as you were able to keep your job, you were probably doing okay, which actually makes this time worse if you ask me, because even if you do have your job, or your 2 jobs, or 3 jobs, it's much harder to survive today. So I would even argue to say that no matter how bad things get, you're always going to have a lot of people say that the economy is good and we're not in a recession, because chances are the people who are saying that are still not really being affected by it, and they may never will be. Maybe they're already rich enough where they don't have to worry about if there's an economic downturn, or they don't even have to work anymore and they'll be just fine. But I would say that inflation is worse than a recession and agree with most people, because the thing about inflation is it affects everyone, right? We have high inflation right now that's not going away. It's still higher than it was at the beginning of this year. That's something that everybody has to pay for. No matter how rich you are, you have to pay for high inflation. And here's another reason that inflation is likely worse than having a recession. And that's because during a regular recession like we had in 2008, and we actually had deflation, the government can boost unemployment and give more people free money to help them make ends meet so their finances don't completely collapse, and it won't have a big impact on inflation because we already don't have a lot of inflation, at least back then, right? But if they were to do the same thing now, it would be devastating. It would just make inflation even worse if they try to bail people out with more free money. Inflation is really the enemy here, guys. It robs you of your purchasing power day by day. The government can't fix it by printing more money, which is their solution to everything. It affects everybody. So that's the interesting thing, that you still see people saying, well, this isn't a recession or the economy is good, because everybody still has to pay for all this. And honestly, I feel like no matter how rich you are, you're still smart enough to realize that things are costing more, but the difference is if you have the money, maybe you just don't care. And guess what? The only way that the government can fix inflation is by doing something that they're not willing to do, which is to stop the deficit spending, stop borrowing money, stop increasing the debt, and start acting responsibly. But they don't want to do that. See, this is what we need, guys, right here. May peace prevail on earth is written in 8 languages on this pole over here. Now, the only other thing that can make a recession potentially worse than inflation is how long a recession lasts. And, once again, going back to 2008, that was a pretty long recession we had, about 18 months or so. Because of the duration of it is what made it so bad. But I think we're getting hit with a 1-2 punch here. It's that we're already experiencing high inflation for close to 2 years now. It's finally coming down a little bit, right? But the damage has already been done and things are still super expensive. Simultaneously, we're heading into the recession, which is a really bad combination. It's just something that we haven't seen before in our lifetimes anyways. And so to me, it's no wonder that consumer sentiment now hit its lowest level in 7 months. You always have the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Survey, which was just released on Friday, which shows that it has hit its lowest level in 7 months in June. It came down to 65.6, which was down from 69.1 in May, and economists expected it would be at 72. So once again, this prevailing theme that I keep talking about here on the channel, all the economic data that the economists and the government and the Fed are expecting keeps coming in worse and lower than they expect, which is another big sign of weakness and shows you that these guys think things are a lot better than they really are right now. Because once again, those are the people that aren't going to be affected by this. High inflation, so what? I'm rich. If we hit a recession, so what? I'm not going to lose my job. The Fed's still going to operate. The government's still going to operate. So they're not affected by this stuff like the average person is. So they don't have to care as much as you and I do. For us, our earnings in the real world can really go down. And when you combine lower earnings with higher costs of living, that's a pretty bad combination. So no surprise here, but the assessments of people's personal finances dipped due to modestly rising concerns over high prices as well as weakening incomes. This is exactly what we just talked about. So the consumer sentiment is mirroring what's happening in the economy, guys. That's no coincidence. They also say that households are struggling more under the weight of higher interest rates and still elevated consumer prices, which is something that's never going to go away. Eventually, the interest rates may go a little bit lower, which has yet to be seen. But even if they do, they probably won't go to where they were pre-pandemic or during the pandemic. And the high prices, unfortunately, are here to stay. we're not going to see anything get cheaper. We're just going to see it get more expensive at a slower pace. That's what inflation is. And most consumers, check this out, they think that inflation is still going to be at 3.3% a year from now. That's the most recent inflation data that we have. And the consumer sentiment survey says, yeah, we're still going to have 3.3% inflation in a year from now. That will be very bad, guys. Very, very bad. And what this survey shows you is that a lot of people are just fed up with the higher prices, regardless of whether or not inflation is cooling. The job market is not helping. We talked about that the other day, that people are continuing to try to get these jobs that seem to be fake. You know, there's all these job postings that you have people out there literally filling out hundreds of applications and not getting hired, even though they're well qualified for the position. So I think people are starting to catch on, like, hey, wait a minute, this is not as good as we're being told. And I don't even have to tell people that anymore. People are starting to figure it out on their own because it's starting to affect their daily lives now. And you know who's dumbfounded by this is Jerome Powell. Okay, listen to this quote that he said, guys, and just shows you the disconnect from the elite and the people in charge versus the everyday Joe. He says that people experience what they experience. All I can tell you is what the data shows, which is that we've got an economy that's growing at a solid pace. We've got a very strong labor market with unemployment at 4%. It's been a long time since we've had a long stretch of time with unemployment at or below 4%. A very long time. So that's what he's focused on. He's fixated on the fact that unemployment is still sitting at 4%, which is historically low. And what did we talk about the other day? It doesn't really matter, because when people become unemployed, they either have a second job, so they're not considered unemployed, number one, or instead of filing for unemployment, they just simply start doing freelance work. They start doing gig work to make up the difference, because that's easier and faster and more lucrative than filing for unemployment. So, hey, I just lost my job. Tomorrow I'll start driving for Uber instead of going to file for unemployment, because that will be faster and easier, and I can continue making money right now, which we know that people need the money right now. People like Jerome Powell, who are literally in charge of making policy decisions for this country, are not understanding the average person's dilemma right now. They're not understanding that people are not keeping up with inflation, and they're not understanding that, oh, even though unemployment's low, they can't go out there and get the job that they're trying to get. He must not be reading any of these stories or watching any of these videos. And why would they? They're set for life. When Jerome Powell and all the other people at the Fed retire, they're going to sail off into the sunset and never have to worry about money ever again. Even if inflation is double digits, they'll probably still be fine. So it's just things like this, guys, that really drive me nuts, and I get so sick of these people, you know, thinking that they know everything about the economy because they're looking at a few headline numbers, and they just think they know, but they don't. You know, all these people in charge should be forced to live on the median income of this country. They should be forced to live on $75,000 a year, have to pay $400,000 or $450,000 for a house today, and have to go out and feed their family on that budget and make it work. And then I think they would start realizing that, wait a minute, maybe these headline numbers are trash and mean nothing, you know? But that's never going to happen. See, I have the good ideas, but it's just things that are never going to be implemented in practice. And so for anybody who made it this far in the video, I am walking along the Rock River, and this is a little town called Rock Falls, Illinois, and it's just down the street from where my sister is getting married today, so I'm very proud of her. Congratulations, Sarah. And so after this, I'll be heading over there and watching her get married. So once again, guys, thank you for all of your support on the channel. It really means a lot to me. For everybody who watches all these videos and gets something out of it, makes me know I'm doing the right thing in this world. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to the channel. And if you don't want to wait for my next video to come out, check out this one on the screen right over here, and I'll see you in the next one.